Then on Sports Central, we go over our first college football schedule preview of this offseason, and it's going to be over the Alabama Crimson Tide, the runner-ups of the 2021 college football season. And this was a team that definitely impressed over the course of the 2021 season. I mean, this team had a lot of inexperience going into the 2021 season. If you look at this roster after 2020, I mean, this team lost a lot of players. And so, I mean, there are a few question marks for this team going into 2021 and whether or not this team could remain a national contender in the season. But, I mean, this team was definitely a national contender. They made it to the national title game, ended up losing that game to Georgia, unfortunately, for the Crimson Tide. But either way, just an outstanding season for Alabama, and there's definitely a very bright future ahead. I can tell you for the Crimson Tide, especially considering, I mean, this team they were pretty young in the 2021 season, and going into 2022, they're only going to get more experience and only going to get better, and that's what we're going over here today. We'll be going over a few players that Alabama will be losing, who they'll be returning, and also looking at their schedule for the first time this offseason, starting out with your record and notable games from last season. This team was 13-2 last year. And, of course, if you look at this team down the stretch, they played outstanding. They beat Ole Miss, of course, 42-21. And the Rebels, they were a good team last season, and this team dominated them back in early October. Their one loss in the regular season was a confusing one to Texas A&M. That was definitely one of the most unpredictable games of the season. Who would have seen that coming? Alabama going into College Station and taking a loss there, especially, I mean, Texas A&M, they were in a tough spot going into that matchup. I mean, the Aggies did not have much momentum at all, so that's why it was such a shocking upset. But for the Crimson Tide, of course, I mean, this team definitely got better from that game. They beat Auburn in the Iron Bowl and rivalry week, which was a big win, even though they went into a couple overtimes there. But this team did beat Georgia in the SEC championship. So Alabama, they did win the SEC title this season, even though they did not beat Georgia in the national championship. And they also beat Cincinnati there 27-6 in the college football playoff semifinals. So, I mean, for Alabama, this was a good season for them, and it really shows a lot of potential in this team as we head forward into 2022. And obviously, that Texas A&M loss. I mean, if you look at this team, they were stuck behind Georgia all the way up until the SEC title game after that loss to Texas A&M. But I mean, obviously, they did beat Georgia in the SEC title game, but once again, they just could not get it done in the national title game. Looking at your returning production going into next season, of course, Bryce Young, your Heisman-winning quarterback, is coming back, which is going to be huge. And honestly, that's enough. I mean, that's all I got to really say. And I mean, it's pretty clear that Alabama is going to be a national contender once again next year, or they definitely should be. I mean, with Bryce Young coming back, I mean, it was just insane what he did last season as a first-year starter. He put up 4,800 yards on the year, 47 touchdowns, 7 picks. 67% completion rate as well. So he's an accurate quarterback. He does not turn over the ball very much. And I mean, of course, I mean, this is a quarterback that, I mean, once again, I mean, this was just his first year starting for Alabama. So I mean, the future is very bright for Bryce Young. Really looking forward to seeing how he progresses over the course of this offseason and improves going into 2022. But the running back situation, of course, you do lose Brian Robinson. He put up 1,600 yards on the season, 16 touchdowns in total. So that's going to be a tough loss, probably one of the toughest losses that this team takes there in the backfield. But Trey Sanders is coming back. He was your second running back last season. So definitely keep an eye on him. It looks like he'll be definitely one of the leaders in the backfield. So keep an eye on him. Jamison Williams and John Mechie, your top two receivers, will not be around next season. And both of them are going to be brutal losses as well. I mean, if you look at Jamison Williams in particular, 1,600 yards, 15 touchdowns on the season, and then John Mechie had 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. So both receivers really combined for an outstanding season. That's going to be tough for Bryce Young, but if it's any example for you guys, looking at 2020 to 2021 for Alabama, this team lost a lot after the 2020 season. They lost. I mean, if you look at this roster, I mean, Devontae Smith was gone, Najee Harris, Mac Jones all took off. Those are your big three in the offense for Alabama, plus a few others. And Alabama, this team has got so much depth, and the recruiting is so good with this team. It's just incredible what this team has been able to do. And I mean, they are the dynasty in college football, and it's very clear. I mean, just based off how much depth there is on this roster, and so I'm not too concerned about this team losing as much as they are, just because of how much depth there is on this roster. I mean, Cameron Latu, he had a good season. He put up 400 yards and 8 touchdowns. He's coming back, so that's going to be a huge return there. And also Slade Bolden is gone, so he was your third wide out last season, and he didn't have quite as big of an impact, of course, as John Mechie or Jameson Williams, but he still had an impact on this team. So receiving core really takes a couple of big hits, something to keep an eye on there for sure. But, otherwise, if you look at this team, Bryce Young coming back is, that's all you really need to know. He's just an outstanding quarterback, to say the least. And, Heisman winning, he won the Heisman for a reason, and that being just how outstanding of a player he is. So, but looking at the defensive side of the ball, you do lose 2 defensive linemen. Your linebacker, Allen, he will not be returning going into next season. So that's going to be a tough loss there in your linebacking core. And, of course, you got 2 defensive backs also taking off. So there are a few key losses for sure with Alabama. But once again, this team has got tremendous depth. So really, this returning production does not, or the players that they're losing, doesn't really concern me too terribly much. The receiving core is probably what would concern me, if anything. But once again, this team has got tremendous depth on both sides of the ball, not just on the offensive side. And national favorite heading into 2022, that's a huge question. And I think this team definitely is right up there for sure. If you look at this team, and once again, I definitely think, Alabama last year, they came just 1 game short of winning the national title. But next season, I would probably say they are my favorite to win. I've currently got them ranked number 1 in my way too early rankings based off of January. So, I do think this team is going to be a big contender going into next season. Looking at the transfer portal and their recruiting as well, Jermaine Burton from Georgia, he is transferring over to Alabama. That is a huge addition for the Crimson Tide. He was a huge impact player for Georgia last season, and it's kind of crazy how Jermaine Burton, he transfers in conference to one of the big rivals of Georgia, which is Alabama. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And the receiving core is, they do lose a couple of key players for sure, but bringing in Jermaine Burton is going to be huge for this receiving core. If you look at defensive back-wise, you got Eli Ricks, who's coming in from LSU. Marcus Banks is taking off to Mississippi State. Jaleel Billingsley, he's taking off to Texas. Shane Lee, a linebacker, is going to USC, and Javon Baker is going to Kentucky. So you do lose a few key players to the transfer portal, but you also bring in a couple of big-time players there in Eli Ricks and Jermaine Burton. Recruiting-wise, this team is ranked number 2 as well, and in the SEC, they're number 2 as well. I think this team is ranked just behind Texas A&M, if I'm right. I think Texas A&M is number 1 in the 2022 ranks for recruiting. That being said, let's look at your schedule going into next season. Just a first look at your schedule, and I'll be giving you guys a game-by-game prediction once we get closer to later spring and into summer. That's when we'll do our official predictions and predict every game. But I'll be giving you guys a quick look as to what I expect out of this team, and potentially a record projection as well. And looking at this team, they play Utah State in week 1. Utah State, decent football team, but when you compare them up to Alabama, it's kind of tough to compare them. You do play Texas on the road. That's an intriguing matchup for sure. A rematch of a national championship a few years ago. You play Louisiana Monroe, Vanderbilt at home as well, Arkansas on the road, Texas A&M is at home, Tennessee on the road, Mississippi State at home. And into November, you play LSU on the road, Ole Miss on the road, and then Austin Peay and Auburn to finish out the season. So, your schedule isn't terribly difficult. You don't play Florida or Georgia, or, you do play Tennessee, which they could be decent. Arkansas is going to be good. Texas A&M is definitely going to be good. LSU potentially. I don't know about LSU. Ole Miss is losing quite a bit as well. So, the schedule isn't terribly difficult for the Crimson Tide. And, even the non-conference games aren't terribly difficult for the Crimson Tide going on the road to Texas. But then again, the Longhorns have had their issues. And Utah State is a good football team, but stacked up against Alabama, the Crimson Tide will be a clear favorite. But that being said, let's get to my record projection for the Crimson Tide. Once again, I'll be predicting every game by game, once we get to later spring and into summer. But for now, here's what I got for the Crimson Tide. I've got you guaranteed wins over Utah State, Louisiana Monroe, Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Austin Peay, and Auburn. I'm going to put in the games that are in yellow. Those are the games I do think Alabama is more likely going to win, but potentially not quite as confident on those games. And those games are Texas, Arkansas, Texas A&M, Tennessee, LSU, and Ole Miss. Mainly because, that Texas game, I'm pretty confident that Alabama's going to win that game. And, I definitely think that's a win for the Crimson Tide. But I'm going to put it in yellow just because it's going on a road environment in the second game of the season. So I will put that as a yellow game. Arkansas is going to be a good team next season. Texas A&M, I do think, is going to be a contender as well. Tennessee being on the road, I'm going to put that one in yellow as well. LSU and Ole Miss as well. So I'm not predicting really any losses for the Crimson Tide right now. If if I had any losses on their schedule, they'd be in orange or red. But for now, I'm going to go with 11-1 to 12-0 for the Crimson Tide. I definitely think Alabama is going to be a big contender next season, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this team in the national title game next year, definitely with a chance to potentially win once again yet another college football playoff title. But let me know your first thoughts on the Crimson Tide in the comments below, and I appreciate you guys all watching. As always, stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.